Morning.
Morning.
Thank you for that very brief introduction. I usually don't go that long, and by the time you hear so much about yourself, you wonder, whoa. When you hear it all at one time, sometimes it can be a little overwhelming. I brought with me my little flyer from your seat here that has the program inside, because on the cover of this is someone who's very important to me and to our nation. Two someones, but one in particular there. I believe this picture was taken April 9th, 1963, as the truce was called in Birmingham, Alabama. And you can see the seriousness on the faces of the gentlemen at the table. When I travel, oftentimes I carry this picture with me. As most of you, especially the historians, know, there's a third guy who's we're not seeing right here, Reverend Ralph David Abernathy. And I usually start by I say, everybody in the room knows one of these gentlemen. And I ask for a show of hands of how many people can name two of them. And usually about half the crowd can do that. And then I ask for a show of hands of who can name all three. And I usually get somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen hands to go up. And so I then tell you, I'm here to talk about the third guy. And so most recently, the last encounter I had was a speech that I gave on Martin Luther King's birth date in Lansing, Michigan. And I actually gave them a homework assignment. I said, I'm a teacher by trade, and so I'm an educator, and I thought about giving you an exam. And so the audience thought that was a little funny. I said, but I do have a homework assignment for you. So I'm going to give you a homework assignment also. And I'm going to give it to you up front. What I'd like for you to do is to tell somebody else about this great man that I had the awesome privilege to be so close to. 3 years ago, I had the awesome opportunity to visit Harvard University and Radcliffe College here in Massachusetts on the occasion to receive an award honoring my late husband at Harvard's law school. As I strolled along the cobblestone sidewalks of Cambridge, I was overcome by the influence of our founding fathers on display everywhere. In my mind's eye, I could see Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and the others as they went about their ordinary days constructing what would eventually become this great democracy. From historic churches to cemeteries to statues of great men, to astounding architecture, I was amazed. After a while, I concluded that history is not intended to be a bird's eye view or account of events comprised by members of the majority in a society, but it's rather destined to be the resounding voice of all its participants. By the conclusion of my stroll with renewed vigor, I grabbed a hold of my commitment to not only continue my husband's legacy through education, but to assist others in clarifying his specific role in the movement. Now, at this juncture, I would like to pause for a disclaimer. In this room, I am surrounded by historians, any of whom could stand before you and one who will just as soon as I sit down. And with no doubt in my mind, they could raise the tiny hairs on the nape of your neck with tales and details regarding some facet of this great story that we call the American experience. I am not a historian, and neither am I a historian wannabe. What I am is the expert in the room on the motivation and determination of Fred Shuttlesworth. And I'm going to put a pause there because I just saw our good friend Diane McWhirter walk into the room. If there's a second woman in the world who knows my husband almost as well as I do, it would be Diane. Good morning, my dear. We were significant friends for 20 years before becoming husband and wife. I'm here to tell you that no writer can match the intricacies or the intimacies derived from knowing another man's heart. In an obscure way, you see, education brought Fred and me together. As the second Mrs. Shuttlesworth, he was 36 years my senior, and when we met, I must tell you that I was not overly impressed with Fred the man. Imagine that. But there was no denying the importance that he played on the world stage in the area of civil and human rights. Like every other facet of his colorful life, he was persistent in his pursuit of our friendship. After a while, two things captured my attention. I recognized that he was a lifelong learner, and I found his wisdom captivating. I thought it wise to slow my pace and to learn from him. So I began to listen to his stories, his challenges, and even his jokes. And I asked questions, lots of questions. Little did I know that the day would come when I'd have to tell his stories for him. In what would be his final interview in the winter of 2010, he challenged us all, saying, quote, "We must tell the story, the whole story, and then inspire future generations to recognize that as long as there is a struggle between good and evil, our work is never done." Fred Shuttlesworth, the eldest of 9 children, was born out of wedlock and into poverty in Alabama's Black Belt on March 18, 1922. At age 3, the family moved to Birmingham, where Fred's mother later married William Nathan Shuttlesworth, giving young Fred his new surname. He was an inquisitive child, and as a student, he excelled in every subject. Fred's maternal grandfather, a Methodist minister, had long since instilled into his daughter Alberta the value of faith and the omnipotence of God. Since the local Methodist church only convened 2 Sundays a month, the family attended the Baptist church the remaining Sundays. Both denominational doctrines would eventually be revealed to Fred, helping to shape his worldview. By the time young Fred was a teenager, he began to question why Southern blacks had no rights that whites had to honor. As he had learned in both churches, all people were made in the image of God. At school, Fred continued to master his studies, graduating valedictorian of his high school class in 1940. By that time, he would tell you that he knew more of what he could not be than what he could be. Nonetheless, he had narrowed his choice of profession to preacher or doctor. Over the next decade, he would marry, become a father, leave Birmingham, decide on a career, enter divinity school, complete an undergraduate degree, and pastor 4 churches in southern Alabama in preparation for his 1953 return to Birmingham, where his leadership at the Bethel Baptist Church would mark the beginning of a ministry marked by social justice and responsibility, ultimately defining his life's work. Shuttlesworth began to amass a grassroots following, first by challenging his parishioners to register to vote. He also petitioned the city of Birmingham to hire black police officers to patrol the black communities. Soon labeled an agitator by the local establishment, he quickly became the target of hate groups, including the Ku Klux Klan. Then local commissioner of public safety, Eugene Bull Connor, challenged Shuttlesworth openly. Their confrontation, which lasted more than 7 years, would manifest over the years like a well-scored symphony played sorely out of tune. For his efforts, Shuttlesworth was arrested more than 35 times for violating segregation laws, was beaten by an angry mob, blasted by a fire hose, and had his church bombed 3 times. But he remained steadfast to his calling. The hallmark event in his life that solidified his commitment to his life calling, including the willingness to sacrifice his own life for the cause, took place on Christmas evening, 1956. Having announced that he would challenge segregation laws the following day by riding the buses, the KKK decided to alter those plans by blowing him into heaven. Around 9:45 p.m., as Fred Shuttlesworth lay in bed discussing the next day's plan with one of his church deacons, 16 sticks of dynamite exploded just a few feet from his head. When I get to this point in my speech, I always put the paper down. I never write down the rest of that story because I want to be able to tell it again and again and again. I said to somebody the other day, in the Baptist church, they never close down the service without taking you to Calvary, because Calvary was the most important thing in religion in my community. And this was Fred Shuttlesworth's Calvary experience. About 9:45, those 16 sticks of dynamite detonated just a few feet from where his bed was sitting. At the end of that big explosion, the bed was no longer there. He was lying on a mattress in a hole on the ground. The roof caved in. He could see the sky. He said he knew what it was, and he knew that he would not be harmed. And as he emerged out of that hole and blew the dynamite dust from his nose, he went to get his coat, which by this time had, he said, 300 or 400 slivers of wood from that explosion. He said that he knew that God was with him, and what was on his mind was the 27th number of the Psalms. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When my enemies crept upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell. He said, because Mr. God was there. So he emerged from the back of the house. By this time, people assumed that he was dead. I invite you to go online and look at the pictures. He was in that hole in the front of the house that was caved in. As he emerged from the back of the house, he said he encountered a police officer. He called him a burly man who stood as far from him as, I'm sure, from here to the back of the wall there. By this time, a crowd had gathered out front. And he said the police officer looked as if he was seeing an apparition. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Fred said as he took steps forward, the police officer took the same amount of steps backward. There were no words exchanged between them for the longest time. And finally, the police officer says to my husband, Reverend, I tell you what, I know these people and I didn't think they'd go this far, but if I were you, I'd like to give you a piece of advice. I'd get out of town as quickly as possible. And my husband responded to the police officer, Officer, I'm not you. And you go back and tell your clan brethren that if God could save me from this, I'm here for the duration and the war has just begun. You see, what I was asked to do today, some of you might be wondering, well, what does that have to do with charter schools and civil rights? I want you to know that the road that we walk to get to where we are today, there's blood there, lots of sweat there, tears there. People died for this opportunity. I'm so glad that I'm living when I'm living and not 100 years ago. Thus, his fiery brand of unyielding dedication, unshakable faith, and unprecedented courage would define his legacy. The Birmingham climax came 7 years later after Shuttlesworth invited Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to join him in his efforts to end segregation. National SCLC and NAACP leaders converged on Birmingham in the spring of 1963, bringing the national media along with them. Together, they launched Project C for confrontation. The images of police dogs and fire hoses turned on innocent children participating in nonviolent marches to end segregation was more than the nation could bear. America was seeing her ugly face with which her conscience had to contend. While in Birmingham, Dr. King penned his famous letter from a Birmingham jail in response to a letter written by local white clergy calling the movement, quote, unwise and untimely, end quote. Demonstrations were finally called off in May of 1963 after the local businessmen agreed to partial concessions. Over the course of Fred's and my 25-year friendship, I delved deeply into his motivation and preparation for leadership. In the end, he'd say, quote, when God, the man, the idea, and the opportunity get together, change has got to come. Does that sound like him, Diane? Mm-hmm. Yeah. He agreed with President John F. Kennedy that on earth the works of God are done by men and women. He acknowledged the call on his life as a young man and committed himself to, quote, break the back of segregation, end quote, in the South, vowing to kill it or be killed by it. See, the big idea undermining the movement in American history was equal access, precursory to equal opportunity. And educational opportunity was at the top of that list. In a tribute speech penned just 3 weeks after the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Fred wrote these words, quote, it is a form of violence to penalize a man for the color of his skin. It is violence to discriminate in education so that some will always know and others will never learn how in their lifetime. It is violence to deny a man the opportunity to learn and then demand that he knows before he can get a job. That was penned April 27th, 1968. As he struggled to capture his formidable journey on paper in 2006, after I challenged him to write a book, nearly 50 years later, he disclosed what he considered was the biggest error in the struggle to eradicate segregation in the South, and that was the failure to achieve school integration. That attempt came with a big price for Fred Shuttlesworth when in September of 1957 he attempted to enroll 2 of his own daughters and a friend into all-white Phillips High School in Birmingham. As they arrived at the school, they were met by a mob crowd bearing chains and brass knuckles. He would tell you it would be the first time in his life that he was seeing brass knuckles. When Fred Shuttlesworth emerged from the car, the crowd began to beat him, almost to the point of unconsciousness. The incredible account was even captured on film, if you can imagine that. And although that attempt and others of its kind throughout the South failed, they paved the way for others to take a stand and a chance on making things better for future generations. My introduction to school choice began nearly 10 years after Fred Shuttlesworth's attempt to integrate. In the summer of 1966, my brother Bobby, who was entering 1st grade, my sister Katha, who was entering 7th grade, and 9-year-old Sephira Bailey integrated Pope Elementary School in Madison County, Jackson, Tennessee, amid the discontent of the white masses and the disbelief of our Black community. To this day, I contend that the most extraordinary thing about that landmark event was the way in which the decision came about. As a result of the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, our family received a letter that summer from the federal government informing us that school segregation was no longer the law and that school choice was a right for every family, regardless of race. It occurred to me that this thing that we label school choice has gone through lots of changes over my lifetime. Lots of changes. First, During slavery time, the choice was you had no choice. You'd be killed to learn to read. And we've gone from there all the way up to today. But in my time, school choice meant, first it was, you go to the school in your neighborhood. And then in the mid-60s, something changed, and it's like you can go to this school or that school in your neighborhood. And from there, we now have the opportunity to choose from a variety of possibilities for our children. After my forward-thinking mother read and explained the letter to us, she gave us the extraordinary privilege of deciding where we would attend school in a few weeks. You see, we would leave our house and go one direction, and everybody was black. My grandparents were landowners, and that's a great thing. And we'd leave our house and go the other direction, and everybody was white. So I've always been in the thick of things, y'all. No, y'all, that's my Southern word. I am a Southern girl. I've always been in the thick of things. So when we go that way and you pass by the white school, the playground was beautiful, and there was actually toys and a merry-go-round and monkey bars and all these things. And then I'd get back to my black school, and what I had was, what did they call it? A burlap sack. In the South, they call it a croaker sack. I know there are no Southerners in here, but I'm a teacher and I need to teach you something. And so when it came time for field day and May Day, you might have a ball on a string on a pole and do that thing. And then you had this burlap bag, and I was expected to put my left leg, and somebody was expected to put their right leg, and we were supposed to have this race. Well, you can see I'm a tall girl, and in the South, I'm a really tall girl, and so I would be probably a head taller than my partner. Now, how's that supposed to work? So I could never win at that thing. Although I was a good athlete, I had a problem. I had a handicap, you see. So the other problem that I encountered was I love to read. And we got the books that were sent from the white school when they got done with them. And they would be in all kinds of shapes. And so I'd be reading, and in the middle of it, the page would be missing, so you don't know what happened in that part of the story. I found that frustrating. We had very few resources. And in third grade, my teacher thought I was so smart, she had nothing to challenge me with, and so I became teacher's helper. And so my job was to decorate the classroom. So every holiday that came, at Valentine's, she gave me red construction paper, and I had to cut out hearts and put that on the window. And at Thanksgiving, it was turkeys or cornucopias and Christmas trees. You get my drift. And so that was the bulk of my education in third grade. I learned nothing. And I was frustrated by that because I was born a teacher. I knew by age 8 that education would be my profession. So it took my brother and sister and I about 3 minutes. We literally ran out of the house to the southeast corner of the place, and we talked about this for about 3 minutes, ran back in and said to my mother, we want to go to the white school, giving no thought to what we would encounter when we got there. What we knew is we'd have a nice playground, we'd have a nice building, and I couldn't wait to see what was going on inside of there. That kind of reminds me of how it is I'm back with Sabas too. 11 years ago, I worked with him for a year in Cincinnati, which I'll get to here in a minute. But the thing I remembered is we have the kind of schools that children run to and walk away from. And that's what I have wanted for my own education and for that of my children, and now for my little grandson. It took us about 3 minutes of deliberation to decide our fate, based primarily on the appearance of the building and the playgrounds at the white school, which far superseded the facilities at the neighborhood black school. We deduced that the offerings inside the building could only be as superior. Like innocent lambs led to the slaughter. We chose to hang our hats in this new place, having given no thought to the challenges that lay ahead. My first year at Pope Elementary School, I had no friends. The fear and ignorance of those around us manifested itself through taunts and name-calling, threats of violence, and just general disrespect. But somehow these challenges were not enough to cause us to turn back. By year 2, I had made a friend as well as an impact. My new friend Angela, whose mother had already gone on to be with the Lord and who was being raised by a single father, could no longer justify hating me just because of the color of my skin. So I became the nigger and I remained the nigger and she became the nigger lover. That's just how it was. Neither of us cared much about our labels, born out of ignorance. We just innocently enjoyed each other's company while God was doing his work to change the hearts of those around us. During that time, I made my mark as both a student and a budding athlete. Physically strong and mentally capable, it soon became common knowledge that I was an asset to any team formed within the group, oftentimes leading that team to victory. By year 3, I was accepted as a member of the class, one who less capable students relied on for academic assistance, and one who our new young 6th grade teacher appreciated, most likely because she recognized my tendencies to nurture and to teach. By the spring of 1968, something happened that brought about the greatest challenge that I would face as a minority in this setting. April 5th, 1968, the day after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Now let me pause to tell you that Jackson, Tennessee is 85 miles east of Memphis, Tennessee. And there was something about being that close to the assassination that I don't think I'll ever forget. It was a hard night when we heard that Dr. King had been killed. It felt bad to me that he had been assassinated in my home state. Earlier that year, 3 other black students had joined us at the white school, and one of those students was in my class, so there was 2 of us by this time. I will never forget the reaction of my classmates to the historical event. The class quickly spun out of control as if there was a party going on. Children who by this time had accepted the reality that black students really were members of their class suddenly returned to their incorrigible ways. They degraded Dr. King and his works while toying with the fact that our hero had been slain. The 2 of us sat motionless, my anger brewing inside, as I realized that such behavior is always a possibility in the throes of change. I remember being completely hurt, but refusing to allow one tear to escape my eyes while managing the flood of tears in my soul. School year 1969 brought with it a major change, as it was the year of forced integration in our community. From that point forward, until the end of our high school experiences, Kathy and Bobby and I would be called on periodically to mediate matters great and small between the races. As the administration came to recognize that we had withstood the perils and the promises of desegregation nonviolently, and in the process developed into leaders who had made an indelible mark on both races. After high school, both Bobby and I chose Union University, a predominantly white institution known for its excellence in Christian higher education, to further our studies. Having both received music scholarships to the university, we quickly noticed that there was no formal outlet for the few black students on campus to socialize. So together, we organized what was the precursor to a black student union, organizing a gospel choir that performed at local churches and eventually the Bobby Jones Gospel Show in Nashville, Tennessee. I earned my undergraduate degree in 2 years and 8 months. Just before leaving the university, I pledged Chi Omega sorority for the express purpose of challenging a rule on their books denying entry to any non-white candidate. While the sisterhood treated me quite well throughout the pledging process, they cut me in the final round. I was out of time and could not stay around to fight the good fight, but I did my best to challenge the status quo while I was there. Little did I know the value that I would later place on the education I received as a result of school choice. Not only did it prepare me for an extraordinary career in education and an avocation in public speaking, but it prepared my heart for service to my fellow man. It was this preparation that set 64-year-old Fred Shuttlesworth and 28-year-old Sephira Bailey on an unforgettable jaunt through time. Because of our shared vision for a better life through education, we became close friends. We agreed that indeed education was the game changer, setting apart the haves from the have-nots. And for poor, disenfranchised children, somebody had to fight and keep on fighting. So the battle over equal access and equal opportunity continues. The methodologies are more subtle than in past times, but from the pipeline to prison theory of education to staggering healthcare disparities, including infant mortality rates, the war rages on. In his 2002 Presidential Citizens Award acceptance speech, my husband wrote, "This nation has indeed made some progressive steps based on the historic struggles of the 60s, but conservative reactions have taken a stranglehold on freedom's progress toward, quote, equal and exact justice to all men and women, regardless of their persuasion," end quote. It seems to me that those conservative reactions may have a similar stranglehold on the educational processes here in Massachusetts, as well as many other parts of the nation. Just a short time ago, I was invited by the NAACP in Birmingham, Alabama, to attend a community forum on charter schools. And as you know, charter schools, and I've been out of Alabama now for about a year and a half, and I'm not quite sure where they are in the conversation right now. But at that time, it didn't look like it was going to happen anytime in the next 50 years or so. Thinking that I had been asked to participate because of my known charter school participation and leadership, I eagerly agreed. Upon arrival, it occurred to me that I had not asked the question, what's our position? So I asked, and to my amazement, they said, oh, we're against it. I said, so why am I here? I sat in amazement through a meeting that was positioned against charter schools from the start. I watched in further amazement as innocent parents asked probing questions that received answers, many of which I felt were baseless. I wondered how many others in the room had actually any experience at all with charter schools. Never having the opportunity to participate in the evening's discussion, I left the meeting in disbelief with full confirmation that the equal access for which my husband and so many others paved the way so long ago was still a crapshoot on the tables of those who refused to acknowledge the need for change. And although I am committed to establishing a school of choice in honor of my late husband in the state of Alabama, yes, I'll be back, I expect it to be an uphill climb. To be perfectly clear, both Fred Shuttlesworth and Sephira Shuttlesworth believe in quality public education. While we both received our education in the local public schools and remain keenly aware that many of those schools provided a solid education to students, too many of them, oftentimes serving large populations of children of color, failed miserably at producing capable, contributing members of society. Our support of public education gradually broadened to all schools able to effectively and consistently reach the least the lost, and the left behind, increasing their chances at realizing the American dream. My formal experience with charter schools began in 2001, having grown weary of our one-size-fits-all agrarian model of educational delivery had taken its toll on my imagination, and by then the ability to specialize along with the promise of autonomy captured my attention. What could I accomplish if I had the freedom to make many of my own decisions as an educational leader? I took a position with Sabas Educational Systems in a startup school in Cincinnati, Ohio, as the academic quality controller. I'd never heard such a title. The title sounded very businesslike, and I was interested to learn, how does business and academics mix? In my role, the teaching staff reported to me rather than to the school director. And I was basically responsible for the quality of education delivered to our students. Not for discipline, not for the budget, but the quality of education. I could actually focus on one thing. Imagine that, as a school leader, focusing on just one thing, the most important thing. The skills that I learned in that assignment became part of the repertoire that I still rely on today. In 2005, I was hired to lead another Cincinnati charter school out of what they called academic emergency. The school had been in existence by then. We were going into the 5th year, and at that time in Ohio, you could only be in a failing school for 5 years and the state would intervene. So they hired me to save the school. Having the autonomy to create our own improvement plan, we were able to move the school to a status of continuous improvement in just 2 years. In 2013, following the loss of my wonderful husband, I returned to my first love, education. I reacquainted myself with Sabas because I respect the skill and sincerity with which they approach their mission to produce world-class citizens. I applaud the organization's diversity and integrity, as well as the results that we are able to reproduce again and again from so many locations around the world, including right here in Massachusetts. Currently, I spend the bulk of my time leading the efforts at our school in the poorest neighborhood in Lansing, Michigan. Approximately 30 days after we signed on as the management company of Mid-Michigan Leadership Academy, we learned that the school was very low performing. I am appreciating the focused efforts with which we have rallied our stakeholders, determined to provide the same quality education to our struggling community as is available in our most affluent locations around the U.S. and the world. Once upon a time, I questioned whether or not I could endure 30 years as an educator. But I'm happy to report to you that in year 27, I feel as though I have miles to go before I sleep. Moving forward, I hope to see more school choice, more educational opportunity, more accountability, and more success. My husband vowed to never retire from civil and human rights struggle, and he kept that promise. Even after he suffered a stroke in the fall of 2007, we continued to travel the country, sharing his story of hope and change. When he could no longer speak for himself, he sat beside me on stage while I held his hand and became his voice. Like my husband, I too have made a vow, and that is striving to teach somebody something every day of my life until that time when my Creator utters those words that surely my husband heard at his appointed time. Well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things. Come on home to glory, and I'll make you ruler over many. Thank you very much.